journalist based in Jerusalem. He is a colleague at the Columbia School of Journalism, where he has been teaching for quite a few years now, the graduate students. You may see his work in the Washington Post very frequently, and he is just a really wonderful observer of the Israeli scene. This book, War of Shadows, has been a labor of love, I guess it's fair to say, for a very long time. And we're quite privileged to be among the very first to hear about it. Here's what's going to happen. Gershom is going to speak for about 20 minutes using slides that we'll all be able to see. Then he and I are going to have a conversation for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. Please, if you will, put your questions in the chat. You can start to do that whenever they occur to you. I'll try to keep up with them as best I can, and then ask them of Gershom for as long as we can. So I think it's best for us to do it in the chat rather than try any other way. Wonderful. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Gershom Gorenberg.
Thank you. I'm just going to go into share screen for now. You can probably set yourself up so that you can split your screen between the slides and me, so that it's almost like we're live. So first of all, just thank you to Jane and to Jeremy and to Anshe Chesed in general. I wish I were there physically, but it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you from Jerusalem. I want to start with a question which you can answer via chat, which is how many of you had a parent or a grandparent who served in North Africa during World War II? Or for that matter, a member of your family who was living in North Africa or the Middle East during World War II? If anybody has somebody like that and would like to answer in chat, please do. Okay, so we're not getting a lot of answers there, and that doesn't, relatives living in Palestine. The reason that this doesn't surprise me, there's a flood of people. I get more answers of yes when I speak in South Africa or England, but in American memory, the war against Germany tends to leap from Pearl Harbor to D-Day to we won. And yet, for 3 years, more than half of the war, North Africa was where the British and then the Allied forces fought Italy and Germany. Not only that, the real story of the decisive battle, which was an intelligence breakthrough, is either missing or incredibly fragmentary in accounts of the war. The heroes of that battle have been erased, and not by accident. To understand that, I want to take you on some time travel. This will be one of those guided tours where you hop from one landmark to another, and in this case, from one date to another, so stay with me. Our first stop is downtown Cairo on the 1st of July, 1942. If you were sitting in this cafe or looking out over the department stores and apartment buildings of a city that was built to be the Paris of the Middle East, if you'd looked west toward the Nile, you would have seen pillars of smoke rising from British General Headquarters, Middle East, from the British Embassy, from the Royal Air Force Headquarters, because clerks and soldiers are burning papers. And the fires are so hot that some of the papers are lifted up before they burn, and top secret documents and scraps of code books are floating out over the city. That morning, the 1st of July, 1942, a British code officer named June Watkins got off her shift at the RAF's code room in the basement of a downtown hotel. And on the street, she ran into a South African officer she knew who took her for coffee at a favorite hangout of British officers, Gropey's Garden Cafe. But when they got there, they were told that they couldn't sit in the garden. The garden was closed, so they drank inside. June went down to the ladies' room and looked out through the window at the top of the ladies' room into the garden and saw that the staff was in the garden painting signs in German, greeting the officers of Erwin Rommel's army. if you'd gone to the Cairo train station that day, well, it was like the scene in the movie Casablanca in the Paris train station the day before the Germans got there, but without the rain. The train station in Cairo was packed with people who were trying to get on trains either to flee south to Sudan or to get the overnight train east to Palestine. A couple of days later, as part of what was going on then, the Turkish Embassy in Cairo radioed the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ankara and asked what they should do about all these Jews who were crowding into the embassy asking for visas to Turkey. The answer they got back was no, say no, do not give any visas. You're reading Turkish telegrams in English. The reason for that is that these radio messages were intercepted by the British, translated by GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, the British signal intelligence agency whose very existence was unknown to the public. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, you saw an extremely inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke the Germans' Enigma cipher, but they also broke the diplomatic codes of 24 countries, including, by the way, the United States. And that's why you can read these Turkish telegrams. Everybody knew that Cairo faced very quickly the same fate as Paris, as Belgrade, as Warsaw. And to understand that, let's look at the map. 10 days before, the Axis forces under Erwin Rommel had conquered Tobruk, where the red arrow is, a small, small port on the coast of Libya. And it seemed like the British army collapsed. In the next 10 days, Rommel advanced to a little spot in the desert called El Alamein, just outside of Alexandria. Let's stop for a moment and talk about Rommel. This is Erwin Rommel with his captured British sand goggles on. He was the most famous of the German generals. He was known as the Desert Fox. His memoir of his time in North Africa, which he wrote shortly before his death in 1944, was entitled War Without Hate, you know, just soldiers in a deadly game of war, a description which totally leaves out the fact that there were in fact people living in Libya and Egypt, that there were civilians there. He gained a post-war reputation as a good German, a patriot, not a Nazi. Let's hold on to that idea for the future, but hold on to the name Rommel, and let's remember that we're in the summer of 1942, and that Palestine is actually a very uncertain refuge from Rommel, because the distance from El Alamein to Jerusalem is barely more than the distance from Tobruk to El Alamein. The expectation among Jews in Eretz Israel is Rommel is coming. That's terrifying, and yet the meaning isn't clear. On one hand, there had just been a report out of London in late June, the first solid seeming report that more than 700,000 Jews had been murdered in Poland. This was from information smuggled out of Poland. And the report noted that some of them had been killed by the use of mobile gas chambers mounted on trucks. With information gathered from elsewhere in occupied Europe, in fact, at the very end of June, the World Jewish Congress said that 1 million Jews had been murdered in Europe. Here's how the item appeared in the New York Times that day. Page 7, short item next to the Saks Fifth Avenue ads. Now, before you start making accusations about ignoring the lives of Jews, you have to understand that this was a very difficult editorial decision, because on the one hand, you couldn't ignore the story. On the other hand, it seemed very doubtful. And it wasn't just in New York that it seemed doubtful. The same day, there was an editorial appeared in the religious Zionist daily Hatzofeh in Tel Aviv that said these items come as rumors taken from the air, passed from one informant to another, one writer to another. This is, how are we supposed to believe this stuff? It just causes despair. What people in Egypt and Palestine don't know is that in Libya, under orders from Mussolini, the authorities were already trucking the Jews of Cyrenaica, of eastern Libya, to a concentration camp in the desert. What they also didn't know is that the SS was so confident of Rommel's victory that they had already created an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing squad for the Middle East. It was under the command of this man, Walter Rauff, the same man who was responsible for the production of mobile gas chambers in Eastern Europe. His orders were to carry out executive measures, quote unquote, against the Jews of Egypt. Once Rommel advanced, the targets would be the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, of Lebanon, of Syria, and Iraq. So this is what's happening as Rommel reaches El Alamein. To understand what happened at El Alamein, time for some more time travel. Let's go back nearly 3 years to the first week of September 1939, to the train tracks of Poland, and to two trains, one entering Poland and one leaving. The first train left Berlin on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion. It's headed east into Poland. It's Hitler's private train. He wants to see his army in action. He's got a battalion that's in charge of his security. In command of that battalion is his favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel proudly writes to his wife that he'd been invited to sit next to Hitler at lunch and that he, Rommel, quote, was allowed to chat for almost 2 hours, unquote, with Hitler about military problems. Rommel writes to his wife, quote, he is extraordinarily friendly towards me, unquote. Rommel worships Hitler. Rommel is also elated to watch the invasion because it fits his idea of rapid warfare, of armored divisions breaking through enemy defenses. But for this kind of warfare to work, you need a machine besides tanks. Because the problem is that headquarters needs to be in touch with the commander of tank forces, who need to be in contact with the units under them. The only way to do that is by radio, but sending battle plans by radio is shouting them out to the world. The solution that the Germans found was a machine that had actually originally been invented for commercial purposes in the 1920s, the Enigma encryption machine, the Enigma cipher machine. This was a portable encryption machine that scrambled messages. In order to decipher an Enigma message, you had to type it into another Enigma machine, but you had to know it had to have the same wiring, and it had to be set up in the same starting positions. The number of possible starting positions was 150 quintillion. That's the small number. The number of possible ways to wire an Enigma machine is 5 times 10 to the 92nd, 5 followed by 92 zeros. It was obvious that this was unbreakable encryption, a phrase that you've heard in modern context as well. But I said 2 trains. The second train left Warsaw 3 days later, September 6, 1939, heading east away from the German forces. On board is the man who could be said to have ultimately have defeated Rommel. This man, Marian Rejewski. Rejewski was at the time 34 years old. 10 years before, while he was working on his master's degree in math at a Polish university, he was recruited by Polish military intelligence's Cipher Bureau. And in the autumn of 1932, he was assigned to break Enigma. It took him 3 months to calculate the wiring, the impossible task. And then he and 2 assistants found ways to find the settings. As the war approaches, the Germans start changing the settings daily. This is too much work for Rejewski and his 2 assistants. In July of 1939, they invited 2 British cryptologists, 2 British codebreakers from GCHQ to Warsaw to share their work. In September 1939, as I said, Rejewski escapes via Romania, reaches France, where he continues to advise the British. All of the British work breaking Enigma throughout the war was based on what Rejewski did beforehand. While Rejewski is fleeing, GCHQ settles into its new hidden location in the countryside, an estate called Bletchley Park, a hideous mansion on the rail line between Oxford and Cambridge. Among the people moving in is the Cambridge mathematician Alan Turing. Among other things, he invented, based on Rejewski work, a giant machine that ran through Enigma settings looking for the one that could have produced a particular text. But Turing didn't do this by himself. Another one of the people who moved in that first week of the war was Gordon Welchman, another Cambridge mathematician, an ethereal academician who, besides making Turing's bomb actually work, came up with a really big idea that code breaking wasn't academic work for individual geniuses. It had to be turned into an industry. This is the top secret proposal he wrote in November of 1939. He proposes breaking up the code breaking process into separate stages, expanding it radically, working 3 shifts a day. Welchman turns Bletchley Park into what we would call a high-tech startup. It goes from 100 or so people at the beginning of the war to thousands by the end of the war. In April 1942, Welchman's people break into, for the first time, the version of Enigma used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters in the desert. And this message is decoded. It is reported from a good source that the British will not be strong enough to justify an offensive before 1st of June. This is incredible intelligence. This is British plans. This is the best intelligence source that the Axis has. This decoded message is sent to the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story, who'd been recruited 2 years before at the rank of untrained clerk. Bletchley Park transformed her life. Bletchley Park's success at decrypting German messages was beginning to get into its commander's nightmares, because the question was, if we're reading their messages, what are they deciphering of our messages? So in spring of 1942, Margaret Story gets the rank of research specialist in charge of finding enemy intelligence inside of Enigma messages. I'm sorry that I can't show you her picture. She left almost no trace in her life except for her work. It took me many months to find people who knew her. They told me, picture her as slight, as wearing dark cardigans, as always smoking. They described her as self-effacing, as introspective, as very intelligent, as having daunting intelligence, as having absolutely formidable intelligence, as being shy, very shy, the brain, as speaking 9 languages. More good source messages follow from Cairo. This is one of Margaret Story's reports. The source in Cairo is giving the Axis British positions, plans, mistakes. Rommel's alleged 6th sense of what his enemy was doing was actually the best intelligence source the Axis had during the war. The British need to know who or what is the good source. How can we stop it? In retrospect, there are several suspects. One of them is the possibility that a spy has been brought to Egypt by the Hungarian desert explorer, now a German officer, Laszlo Almasi, who was turned into an absolutely fictional character in the novel The English Patient decades later. Another possibility is that it's King Farouk of Egypt or somebody close to him. The 22-year-old king is known to have pro-Axis leanings. In fact, he had given advance warning to the Germans of the British invasion of Persia in the year before, in 1941. Or maybe it's a British code stolen from an embassy in Europe. Before the war, MI6's counterintelligence chief had visited Berlin and warned of the terrible security at the Berlin embassy. I will leave this mystery for the book. I will just jump forward in time again to June 21st, 1942. Rommel has just taken Tobruk, and this is the message that comes from the good source. If Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, this is a suitable moment. The good source tells Rommel that the British are in the state of collapse. Rommel responds like a compulsive gambler who just got an inside tip. He invades Egypt. He needs to get to Alexandria to have a port to receive supplies. He needs to get beyond Alexandria to Palestine to knock out the RAF bases there, from which planes would take off to attack his shipping. What happens at El Alamein and why, again, I'll leave for the book. I will only say for this moment that the victory in the secret war was the key to the victory at El Alamein. Rommel never knew of the role of Ryuski, of Welchman and Turing, of Margaret Story in his defeat. Why did this story remain hidden even after the war? That has to do with an order that was issued on the 19th of April, 1945, just before the end of the war, that said that anybody who knew of intelligence derived from Enigma had to keep the secret for the rest of their life. Several reasons were given in the memo, in the order, but the first was the most important. The Germans must believe they were defeated by force of arms. Otherwise, as after World War I, they might believe that it's worth trying again. So those who fought the War of Shadows are told, you played an extraordinary role in the victory. For the victory to the last, history must not remember you. 3 thoughts to close with. Were it not for the victory at El Alamein, the SS would have reached Cairo in Palestine. This is one part, and again, there's more in the book, of how the standard picture of the Holocaust being restricted to Europe is too narrow. This is also only a sampling of the intrigues that would shape the Middle East after the war. And finally, as I said, these were forgotten heroes. I hope to have honored them, and I hope that you enjoy reading the full story. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Gershom, so much. I feel like you are so passionate about this story that you want to tell us more and more and more. And yet, of course, we want to read this for ourselves. So let's start at the beginning. Just at the start of the book, you talk about having a conversation with a friend, and that sparked your interest in this work. This is different from the other things that you have written, having more to do with Israeli history and contemporary politics. So tell us your own journey. How did you become so interested in excavating this story? And then second part of the question is, what did you have to do to get it?
Well, as you said, it began with a Shabbat lunch. A friend of mine told me that his father had been a British officer during the war in Palestine, and that the British had either asked or demanded that his mother be evacuated, as they did with the families of officers. And it brought home, I mean, I'd always known that there had been this threat of a German invasion during the war, but it brought home how immediate it seemed to people who were living in Palestine, in Eretz Israel. And I started exploring it, and at a very early point, I ran into these fragmentary stories about espionage. Uh, and the other thing that became very clear was that the stories that had been written were based on memories after the war. They were very incomplete. The documents had been hidden. So I plunged into the archives. I actually went to archives everywhere from Palo Alto to Jerusalem. I visited Bletchley Park, Rome, and Cairo. The streets are also a document. There were many, many days in the British National Archives where I wanted to jump up and shout yes when I found something. You don't do that in the British National Archives. You don't do that in any archives, but certainly not in the British. Um, One of those was the day that I discovered Margaret's story. I have to, this is something only for the Jewish audience. The British documents always refer to her as Miss Story, which of course, Miss Story is in Hebrew mysterious. And she was very mysterious. There's nothing in the documents about who she was, where she came from, anything. So that set off a detective search for her. Eventually, after many months of following one lead to another, I found people who had known her, who could tell me something about this woman. Um, Many of the documents, key documents, actually came from the attics of the children or grandchildren of people who were involved in the story and weren't in the official archives at all. And then I started piecing the story together from that.
Wow. Were you surprised where it took you?
I was constantly surprised because every time I thought I had a story, there was another story underneath that. It's like this archaeology of stories. There were, you know, the Almasi thing is a case in point, and the Spies brought to or allegedly brought to Egypt. There are several books written after the war, and then everybody kept repeating what was in those books. And then there had been a release of British Foreign Office documents in the 80s that changed that story. But right when I started working, I found that MI5 had released its secret file more than 6 decades after the war, and that just like blew away all of the original stories, all of the earlier stories, and that kept happening to me over and over again.
Wow, wow. I noticed that you have organized the book using almost as if it's a cinematic framework, Act One, Act Two, Act Three. And I know that you often think about long form narrative in that way because you have so graciously spoken to my students at the journalism school about this kind of way of thinking through how to tell a long nonfiction story in a way that uses character and narrative and images. So I'm just sort of wondering what led you to organize this book in this way, and what did it call upon you as a journalist? How do you find this out? How do you find out what someone looked like who who was really meant to keep her whole life a secret?
Okay, there's a couple of questions in there. First of all, yes, I think that the way to write story, my aspiration of how to write history, is that it should be like a novel in which all the details are true. Like a novel, it tells the story of unique people in a situation that suggests universals, but they are unique in their situation. And I want to see people as they are in life, which is developing and contradictory. And that means that I'm digging into documents, and in this book, a secondary source was interviews, but because of the distance in time, it was almost all documents. The questions I'm asking are not just what happened, but who the people were. What were they like? In terms of what they looked like, I look for photographs. I love photographs. I love photographs that give different views of the same person. There is an explorer, a British explorer who is in the book named Ralph Bagnold. And I have pictures of him when he's not in the desert, and he looks very, very serious, and he's clean shaven. And then there's pictures of him when he's hundreds of miles from civilization in the midst of the harshest desert in the world, and he has this boyish smile on his face, and he's got a beard because there's not enough water to shave. And the contrast between the two pictures is better than what either single picture could tell me. And then you look for memoirs, you look for diaries, you look for letters. There's incredible collections of the diaries and letters of people who were in the war in Britain. I looked for the children and grandchildren of people. In the case of Margaret's story, I was really flummoxed at first. Finally, I went to I realized that after the war, she'd stayed in GCHQ, and I knew what small town they'd moved to, and I discovered a historical society there, and I asked them to run an ad. You know, anybody who once knew Margaret's story, please get in touch with me. And in the end, I found 4 or 5 people who had known her, who were now very old and had known her when they were very young. And they were able to, you know, like one woman said to me, oh, Margaret, you know, she'd come to your house and go out into the garden, and she identified all the flowers and the birds by their Latin names.
Wow.
You know, and so I'm looking for that information because it's real people who did these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I want to pick up on something you just said in passing before, which is that one of the realizations of uncovering this history and bringing it to light is understanding the real possibility that the Germans could have made it to Palestine. And you said that would change our notion of the Holocaust. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, it's, you know, we looking backward at history, there's this sense that it had to turn out this way. And we'll leave the details for the book, but it didn't have to turn out this way. This whole story was touch and go. There were factors of genius, there were factors of luck that brought this outcome. The SS was ready to reach Egypt and Palestine, and very easily could have done so. That was the potential. But besides that, there's the fact that the Jews of Libya, or of Eastern Libya at least, were sent to a concentration camp. There was what could be called an Iraqi Kristallnacht in 1941.
I don't think that.
Nazi-inspired riots in Baghdad. Baghdad in 1941 was 1/6 Jewish. I want you to think about the fact that Baghdad was more Jewish in 1941 than New York is today. And there was this massive riot in which hundreds of Jews were killed. Those were probably the least recognized victims of Nazism. Walter Rauff, who was supposed to be in charge of the mass murder of the Jews of the Middle East, was later assigned to Tunisia when, as their last act in Africa, the Germans occupied Tunisia, and he was supposed to carry out mass murder there. And it was only the lack of ships to Europe that prevented the mass murder of the Jews of Tunisia, though several hundred were killed by the Nazis. So this was not something that just happened in Europe. Europe is a very artificial boundary. The war was not just in Europe. And I think that it's very important for us to remember those victims and what could have happened as well.
Give me 5 minutes.
I'm sorry. If you're just listening to us, could you please mute? Thank you. Um, so what I still want to understand this a little bit more. Then it's not just at how vulnerable Jews were in North Africa and in Palestine, but that the idea that Jews were thought by the Germans to be interlopers in Europe, how does that argument stand up in Palestine?
Uh, Hitler made it extremely clear that his plans were to murder the Jews wherever his forces reached.
Mm-hmm.
And the original expectation at the time that I was talking about, the summer of 1942, when the Germans were still rolling forward in the Soviet Union as well, their plan was a pincer motion against the Middle East, in which, on the one hand, the armies in Russia would cut south through the mountains into Iran, and they would join up with Rommel's forces coming from North Africa and take the entire Middle East, and then be able to link up with the Japanese who would be coming from the other direction. And their plan was mass murder for all of those Jews.
Right.
The idea of the interlopers, whatever it was said about Europe, is did not include any mercy for Jews in Palestine or the Middle East. And there are old people here and elsewhere in the world, from Tunisia, from Libya, from elsewhere in the Middle East, who are survivors of those plans.
Wow. So just staying in that region for a moment, someone has asked, could you tell us something more about the preparations in Palestine to defend against, or sadly, if necessary, to accommodate a German invasion?
Okay, that's a really good question. This was a question that started from the summer of 1940 when Mussolini went to war and invaded Egypt. It became more intense in 1941 after the fall of Crete. Interestingly enough, for most of that period, the greatest fears were of an invasion from the air, like in Crete, or from the north. There was this constant fear that the Germans would cut through Turkey and invade the Middle East through Syria from the north. If you go to the Carmel Range today, you can see the gun emplacements and trenches that the British built in the Carmel as a defensive line facing north. They did not expect this invasion from the west, from North Africa, until the last minute in 1942, when there was this desperate attempt to turn around the guns. At the same time, and then there was this whole question, which is very complicated in British thinking, of whether or not, to what extent to collaborate with the Jews of Palestine in fighting the Nazis, because there were lots of people in the British leadership who basically, they did not want to give Jews guns. The exception to that was a very secret agency called the Special Operations Executive, whose job it was to train partisans in occupied countries. And they worked with the Palmach, which had just been formed, the quasi-underground strike force of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, and trained them to be partisans. And in fact, one interview that I was able to do, one of the first things I did when I started working on the book, was interviewing Chaim Guri, the late Chaim Guri, who at that time was a 19-year-old Palmachnik that later became one of Israel's most famous poets. And he said, that's where I learned, in the SOE training camp, that's where I learned how to make a time release fuse for a bomb. They trained me in bomb making. So there was this preparation. It was very, very controversial in the British leadership. At the same time, the Jewish leadership of the Yishuv had these huge debates about whether there should be partisan warfare, because there were people in the Yishuv leadership, and there's minutes of these meetings, who said, we shouldn't do that because they'll wipe us all out if we have armed resistance. And there were other people who said, what are you talking about? They're going to wipe us all out anyway. At least we can fight. But that shows you how little they knew, how uncertain they were of what it would mean to be actually conquered by the Germans.
Wow. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So our dear friend Pearl Beck asked this question: how could these secrets have been maintained so long if thousands of people worked at Bletchley Park?
It's a great question. When you start, first of all, nobody knew when they were recruited to Bletchley Park what they were going to do. I have this memoir of this woman, this incredible story, a Welsh woman who was majoring in German in university. And one day in the library of the university in Cardiff, this man walks up to her and says, "Would you like a job with the Foreign Office?" And she has no idea what it is, but she's told it will help with the war effort. And she only finds that you got to Bletchley Park. First, they made you sign the Official Secrets Act so that you understood that there were many people who said they told me I would be shot if I would reveal anything. And the secrecy became such second nature that people simply did not talk about it. In fact, people said afterwards, I never said anything, even if I thought I read it in the newspaper, because I was never sure whether I read it in the newspaper or it was something I learned at Bletchley Park. The secrecy became completely second nature. And I spoke with somebody who knew Margaret's story, and when the secret of Bletchley Park started emerging in the 70s, she was very angry about this, the idea that anybody would talk about it. So even in terms of things like memoirs, that's a very selective genre, because many of the people who work there never said a word about it till the day they died.
Wow. Wow, wow.
It was, by the way, a terrible problem if you were single there, because you got to the end of the war and you went on a date, and of course everybody expected that you'd been in the army and some other branch of the military, especially if you were a Cambridge or an Oxford man. You were supposed to be an officer, and you couldn't say anything about what you'd done.
Well, and you mentioned Alan Turing, and we certainly know that, you know, his story was quite sad.
Yes. When Turing committed suicide in the early 50s, nobody had any idea what he had done for the the war effort. Although I want to stress that the movie version in which Turing did it all by himself is it's good for the screen, but it leaves out many other people who were essential to this effort. And by the way, it also paints him. Let me put it this way. Turing was sent on secret missions to meet with the Polish codebreakers, to meet with American codebreakers. He obviously was somebody who could communicate with other people very, very well. He, it seems, did not particularly like to communicate with people who were less intelligent than him, and that left extremely few people in the world. But the movie picture of him is unfair.
So someone asks, why was it so important to keep these secrets after the war, after it was all over?
Well, as I said, the first reason that's mentioned in this order that was given is the British were very aware of the fact that the Germans had come up with this stab in the back theory after World War I that said we really didn't lose in battle, somebody betrayed us. And they were afraid that if the Germans knew that an intelligence leak had been so instrumental to their defeat, that they would think, if we try it again, if we keep security better or whatever, we can go to war again and win again. And the great fear was of a third round. So it was essential not to let the Germans know. That was helped, by the way, by the fact that the Germans were absolutely 100% certain that Enigma was unbreakable. And when the secrets started coming out in the 70s in bits and pieces, German code experts were in complete disbelief that their code ever could have been broken. Besides that, many of the elements in breaking the code were due to carelessness. And there was a fear that if the secret comes out, our enemies today, the British High Command thought, other countries will get stricter about their code security and will have a harder time breaking into their codes. Well, it's true it was carelessness, but it's also true that carelessness is human nature. and that these breaks continue to happen. And if you want a present day example, just look at the recent news of the Russian hack into American computers, which again has to do with mistakes in code security, but the flaw in the machine is always the human beings using it, and that's almost unavoidable.
Did other countries with their own intelligence apparatus create the same kind of massive secret fortress that Bletchley Park was? I mean, did we have this? Did the Germans have this?
The Germans and the Italians did not create code-breaking branches that were as large. They did have code-breaking branches, but they were nowhere near as large. There was an American parallel, two agencies, one Army and one Navy. That was a huge flaw in the American code-breaking apparatus, is that the services competed with each other. By an accident of history, the British had one agency that worked together and was much more efficient. By the way, one of the British codebreakers who visited the United States during the war wanted to convince the Navy and the Army to work better together. And he came home and reported it's impossible because the Army agency, which had been built from civilians recruited by the civil service, had a lot of Jews in it. And he said, the Navy is too anti-Semitic, they'll never work with the Army agency. But the great breakthrough of American intelligence, led by William Friedman, born in what's today Moldova, brought to the United States at the age of 1 by his parents, was breaking the Japanese codes. The Japanese had a machine that worked similarly to Enigma, and the break of the Japanese codes was an immense asset to the United States during the war.
So David Fishman asks, could you explain more about how Rommel was actually stopped?
There's somebody who's unmuted and musical. How was Rommel stopped? Well, let me think of how to say this without getting into too many spoilers. Rommel, the German army was stopped at El Alamein. That is, very public history. The role of intelligence in that history, there have been, as I said, fragments about it, but the full story, I don't think has been told before. Rommel lost his source right before the Battle of El Alamein. It was precisely at that time that the British succeeded in breaking all of the German radio networks in North Africa, so they were reading German communiques constantly. And weak as the British Army was at this time, that advantage allowed them to hold the line at El Alamein. And the crucial thing was that once Rommel was stopped at El Alamein, which was only 60 miles from Alexandria, he had an immense problem because his trucks had to come all the way from Libya to bring supplies. To bring 1 gallon of gasoline for the tanks at El Alamein, you had to burn another gallon of gasoline for the trucks, and that gasoline, that fuel had to be brought from Europe by ships that were being attacked by the British Air Force. So the sane and rational thing for Rommel to have done once he was stopped at El Alamein would have been to retreat. But of course, the sane and rational thing would have been for Germany not to go to war, not to invade the Soviet Union, not to push Japan to go to war with the United States as it did. Rommel did not have a rational commander. He stayed at El Alamein. In October of 1942, the British counterattacked under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery. And when Rommel did want to retreat, he was ordered not to. And finally, he broke those orders and retreated. And by that time, his army was in a shambles. They were driven back. And then another very important element was for a few days after, I think it's 6 days after Rommel retreated at El Alamein, US and British forces invaded Morocco and Algeria, and what's known as Operation Torch. And at that point, the Axis was facing Allied forces coming from both directions, which eventually pushed them out of Africa and led to the invasion of Italy in 1943.
So just to build on that for a minute, we have another question asking if there were spies on the ground that were working in this operation as well. I mean, was all the spying happening in code and, if you will, cyberspace?
I feel like I'm being asked who done it. There certainly were efforts at human intelligence. The relative role of human intelligence and code breaking, I prefer not to go into more detail at the moment because I really don't want to ruin the reading experience.
So you just have to buy the book. So what does this all mean for code breaking today? Could something like this even happen if, God forbid, we were in some sort of military conflict?
I put forward the hypothesis that the same rule applies to encryption as applies to locks. And that rule, I would suggest, is that any lock that one human mind can design, another human mind can eventually find a way to break. The other mind will either see a flaw that the inventor doesn't see, because we tend to snap our minds shut around our solution. This is what happened with Enigma. Ryuski simply looked at the problem from a different mathematical perspective than anybody else did. I want to stress, Ryuski, when you look at the math that Ryuski used to break Enigma, it seems, well, of course, that's the branch of mathematics that you would use for that. But the British codebreakers also did not believe that he could have done it. They were sure that he had gotten a stolen Enigma machine. So there's another mind looks at the problem in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that in order to make encryption usable, it has to be simple. If you get too complicated, people break the rules. You're told you have to have a 14-letter password with capitals and numbers and symbols, and you have to change it every 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So you write it down on a piece of paper and leave it on your desk. Just like the guy who looked at one of the British embassies before the war, said they have combination locks, but the combination is sitting in a box with a simple key that can be unscrewed with a screwdriver, right? So like you make this all so complicated,
Mm-hmm.
and people take an end run around it, and that creates the opening. And so the company whose security was apparently broken in the Russian hack affair is a company called SolarWinds, and at one time for their update, to get into their update server, the password was SolarWinds123. All right, everybody can remember that, right? So yeah, there are many, many people working in many countries to do this just now. And if they weren't trying to do it, the taxpayers of that country would not be getting their money worth, and the job of the other country is to create ways to stop it. And while we sit here, that secret war is going on constantly.
Mm-hmm. I wonder also if you could tell us about how the revelations in your book and this idea that there was this other very, very important venue for World War II that gets overlooked. How did that shape what we think of as the tensions in the Middle East today?
Well, look, obviously, the way the war went and how it turned out, we live in that reality. I don't want to entertain what would have happened where I'm sitting if the Germans had gotten here, but obviously history would have been very, very different. Beyond that, in each of these countries that was under either direct or indirect colonial rule in the Middle East, there was a debate about, an internal debate about how to relate to the war. we know the famous Ben Gurion statement, we will fight the Nazis as if there is no white paper. We will fight the white paper as if there were no Nazis. That wasn't this seems like an obvious decision for the Jews, because it was obvious to the Jewish community in Palestine, even as hostile as they felt toward the British at that moment, that my enemy's enemy is a greater enemy. But that's not all. We know that there's this cliche that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And in fact, in Egypt, there was this huge political divide about whether to fight with the British or side with the Axis. Among the people who wanted to side with the Axis were many officers in the army. And in fact, a young captain by the name of Anwar Sadat was arrested as a collaborator with German intelligence during the war. In fact, the British ambassador wrote on the report by hand on the report that he got of this, if this man has given information to the enemy, he should be shot. In the end, it turns out very fortunate for Israel that Sadat was not shot. But that debate went on in Egypt. And in fact, it led to the fact that the Egyptian army never participated in the war. Something like 30,000 Jews from Palestine eventually signed up for the British forces, as well as the people who were trained in the Palmach. When Egypt invaded Palestine in May of 1948, the Egyptian officers thought this was going to be a walk because we're just fighting these amateurs. Turned out the amateurs were the Egyptians, with obvious consequences to this day.
Wow. So luckily we have time for one last question, and it's a wonderful one. Are you a math nerd? How did you have to do some special training to understand codes and math?
That's a great question. Until I was about 12, everybody was sure that I was going to be a mathematician. Then I discovered writing.
I didn't know that. That's so interesting.
I discovered that writing and people were more interesting, but in this case, the two things went together. The really big challenge is how much math to explain, because I know that other people don't necessarily fall in love with numbers. I had a wonderful day in Britain while I was working on this book. I needed to go to this archive in Cambridge, and I actually got a ride from my friend's house in London to Cambridge with somebody who taught math there. And I said, look, there's this expression in this discussion of how many variations there are in Enigma. Could you explain to me how this works? And so we spent the hour drive to Cambridge, him giving me a great math lesson, which ended up in a footnote, because with some of the math, I put it in footnotes. I said, look, if you really want to know the math, it's in the footnotes. I don't want to, there's people who, when they see some of those numbers that I presented in the slideshow, their eyes cross. So I, wanted to be careful with that.
But it does make me wonder if one reason this story might not have been told so well before is because it is complicated, and because most of us aren't able to really comprehend numbers like that.
Well, I think that that's a reason that, there's a constant battle when you're telling the Enigma story, of what to do with it. Somebody mentioned in the chat that the first book that came out in English, there'd been a book in Polish and a book in French before that, which is part of the reason that the British let the book appear in English in the 70s, called The Ultra Secret. It's highly inaccurate, and its explanation of how Enigma was broken is like really wrong, and makes it sound like this is one-time break and then everything was simple from then on. And the difficulty with the technical side may be part of that. There are books about the subject, both with American code breaking and British code breaking, that I think explain these things, but you have to really be into the numbers and the technical stuff to get through them.
So Gershom, before we sign off and let you go back to sleep, is there something else that you wanted to share with us about the book, or what you learned from the experience?
Well, I think, I learned that there's a lot of people that we owe a lot to that we never know who they are. There's some stories in the book about that. I learned that underneath every story that we think we know, there's going to be another story. And I suppose in another 20 years, maybe something else will be declassified and somebody will come and dig 3 layers deeper than my story and find more stories, and that's fine. And as I said before, I hope I've honored those stories and those people, and I hope that you enjoy reading about them.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This really has been revelatory and fascinating. I hope everyone's appetite has been whetted, and you'll go out now that it's available um, and get War of Shadows. Gershom, I'm so looking forward to seeing you in person on the Upper West Side, over
Thank
the
you.
Shabbat table and in the classroom and everywhere. Thank you to Anshe Chesed for hosting this conversation. And stay safe, everyone, and be well.
Yes, stay safe. I want to see you all this summer. Bye-bye, and thanks so much. And thank you, Jane. That was wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. This was great.